Good morning, everybody. Let us begin. My name is Gayleen Tobin Vanden Heuvel. I'm the Executive Director of Western Research Parks. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here to the special event, How to Start a Medical Device Company. Today, I'd like to proudly acknowledge our co-hosts, Western Technology Transfer Office, BioNext, Western Research Parks, along with our partners at Megalab, and we are very grateful for their collaboration and shared commitment to helping ideas grow into impactful innovations.
What we do at Megalab, there's a couple things. That's a picture of our lab in there. At the very end there, you can see that very large box. That's an anechoic chamber for EMI testing. So in general, we do product testing and certification. So if you see some of the acronyms up here of the big guys in the industry, you'll recognize maybe some of those safety certification marks. So primarily, we test things. If it plugs into a wall, it has a battery. There's something called EMC testing, electromagnetic compatibility, measuring EMI noise that's coming off of devices. There's product safety testing, fire, shock, mechanical hazards that all kinds of products go through. We also do some things on packaging testing for different things in the food industry. If you want to sell, whether it's a medical device or a pack of crackers, they'll be going through packaging testing because you want to make sure your $500,000 mass spectrometer ends up in Korea the way it's supposed to, and not with a bunch of screws loose at the bottom and dents and whatnot. So that's the basis of what we do on the testing side of things. And about a year ago, Kirusha came up to us as our former client and said, "Hey, I got a great idea. I think other than only doing testing, there's a whole lot more, if we're speaking medical today, that medical device companies need help with. They need help with QA and RA, which is in quality management." So we said, well, Vince was our client back in the day. I think he'd be the perfect person for that. They're going to need help with clinical trials and validation and usability and a whole slew of things that Kirusha can help with. So we can go from basically, I have an idea, is it feasible, all the way through that, product design and development, and final testing when you hand in your test reports to the FDA and Health Canada. So we kind of try and be like a one-stop shop. So for the purpose of this presentation, it'll be more towards the hardware testing. So you have a physical device that's active, right? It's electrical in nature. And that's what I'll spend about 10 minutes on today. So I call this one the roadblocks to medical device certification and how to avoid them. Because over the years, we've seen, hundreds of clients, and they mostly make the same mistakes. A vast majority of our clients in this area are the small startups. So if you're working for Medtronic, you might have a regulatory person who's put dozens of products to market, and that's all they do all day, right? But if you're a small startup, that's that's definitely not the case, right? They don't teach this really in school. You just kind of get into the industry and you kind of gotta figure out, okay, what kind of testing do I need to do? And you're going to make mistakes along the way. Everybody makes mistakes along the way. So we're going to talk about some of the most common ones. So the number one is to know your standards. There's many out there for medical devices. The main base one that you're going to come across a lot is IEC 60601-1. That one's -1-2. EMC testing. So that is electromagnetic compatibility. So if you want to sell your device and you want to get through your FDA and Health Canada, you're going to have to show them some test reports that you comply with this. So it's you don't want to have too many emissions, EMI noise coming off your device. And in the medical device field, if you think about being in an emergency room with all that sensitive equipment, you also don't want other equipment to interfere with your device. So that could be a minor inconvenience, right? In some cases, this is flickering, the hospital bed won't go up and down because somebody's walking by with a radio. Or it could be really serious. Somebody's walking by with the radio, the ventilator stops working because there's too much EMI noise, right? So that's why in the medical field, it's a lot stricter than other fields. Now, the other one that you'll see down there is electrical safety, IEC 60601-1. That is your basic fire, shock, mechanical hazards. All those things won't apply to all devices, So if you have a hospital bed that moves up and down and has pinch points, mechanical testing will be a big part of that. If you have a tiny little USB powered device or like a wearable that goes on your wrist, then mechanical testing won't really be a thing for that, right? Maybe even the fire and shock, not so much for that. So we can get into all that. This standard alone, either one of these would be like people spend like a whole day going into all that and what all the tests are and whatnot. So we won't go into that at this point, but we can talk about them later. So if anyone has any specific questions on that, like when we go out and do the breakouts or whatnot, I can answer some or most of them. Kirusha's probably, so she actually did this kind of testing in our lab, the EMC and safety. She actually knows more than I do. And if we can't answer something, get our contact info. I can put you in touch with one of the engineers that we have. That is a picture of an EMC chamber. So that is one of the biggest ones in Canada. It's 10 meter. It's called a 10 meter chamber, which it doesn't mean it's literally only 10 meters. It means that the antenna will move back 10 meters. So larger equipment can go in there. So at the end there with the green on the floor, you will see styrofoam there. And there's actually a turntable there. So equipment will go in there, rotate at 360 degrees. And that antenna will back up considerably and will measure the EMI noise that's coming out, which is called radiated emissions. And basically, if you're there doing radiated emissions, there's a software outside. It's like watching paint dry if everything goes fine. If you see large red spikes, on the software, that means that you have some emissions issues and that we try and fix them with you there on the spot. So that's a big question, like how many times do these things fail? EMC has a high failure rate. Most of the time, that can be fixed with us in the lab. Like we can apply chokes, ferrites, things like that, put it back in the EMC chamber, see how it responds. Sometimes it is on the design, in which case, we will stop the project and say, look, your power supply is noisy, or, the board design, or, you got to come back and work on it later on in the future. So that was a pretty big investment for us. I think that's about a $2 million chamber, and then lots of equipment outside as well. So when I mentioned that standard IEC 60601, there's also all kinds of other little headers that go under that. Like you've probably heard the term risk management before. So there's ISO 14971, which is for risk management. So part of your submission to the FDA, you have to have a risk management file. Our job is to review that file thoroughly and be really picky so that when you do submit it, someone doesn't come back and delay your application because they find that, someone wasn't picky enough on your risk management file. So all through your product development, you can risk mitigate things in various different ways. Like this good example here with my laser pointer. So like the laser pointer literally can't work without being a little bit dangerous, right? Because it's emitting a laser. You're not supposed to shine it at your eyes. So there's no way you can have the functional laser pointer without doing that in some way. So that's why there's a warning label on the back of that saying, do not shine the laser pointer right into your eyes. So that's an example, like a really kind of silly example of risk mitigation. But there's lots of things that you can justify that when you're making your product by saying, do this, don't do that. I have a laser guard on something. I have a lock on something. There's various ways to go through that. So that's part of the process when you're looking into safety testing. Now, another thing is there's going to be usability, right? Reviewing your usability file. The list goes quite long. There's dozens of standards, but the main one is like look at the safety one and a couple of the others and get yourself familiar with them and learn a little bit about them. There's a million blogs online about all these things, YouTube videos. You get way more information and help nowadays. And of course, like talking to us, if you ever have questions on these, is a good start. Now, I'm just going to bring up something that's really common, is that if you have a medical device that's used in a hospital or a clinic by a professional like a doctor, that's one thing. As soon as you say, oh, it's a home use device, because home use is becoming much more popular lately. So home use has additional considerations. There's all kinds of these things we call -2s standards, which are collateral standards. So the example that I bring up here is home use. The standard is a 60601-1-11. And the reason it's important to think about that when you're designing your product is because there's additional tests that you have to go through since it's not being used by a professional in that environment. So let's say you have your Holter monitor on and you're wearing it at home all the time. Well, you're going to have to worry about something which we call IP testing, right? Ingress protection, like water and dust testing. Because what happens if I have my Holter monitor on and I'm holding my rum and coke and I spill my rum and coke on my Holter monitor, right? Not something that's going to probably happen in the hospital, but something that could happen in the home environment. Or I actually forgot that I had it on and I went into the shower with it, because those things happen all the time. So we can do that far picture over there. Those are actually really, really expensive nozzles that emit different types of water pressure based on what kind of IP testing the product goes through. So it can go from all the way from submersion. Like I know my Apple Watch here is good for going down 2 meters as long as you don't stay down there too long, kind of thing, right? So it can go all the way from, like, IP tests can be like dozens of meters below the water for a prolonged period of time, or it could be like a ocean mist spray, or it can be like a fire hose in the back. So we had a client making something for the nuclear industry, and we had to get like a fire hose and blast the enclosure and all the seals in the enclosure, because, you know, what if there's a tsunami, or, like, you know, how much can the enclosure take, because you can't have any water getting in there. That on the right here, that's a shock and vibration table. So if you're traveling with something, a medical device or other, and you're transporting it, you want to make sure that it's robust enough. So part of the home use standard will actually be doing shock and vibration on a sample. So you need to kind of think about these things when you come up with your concept of your device, so you can build it properly to avoid disappointment when you think like, oh, I didn't know I had to do shock and vibration testing. Maybe the plastic I chose isn't robust enough. Or, you know, maybe this, like, you know, I didn't know, and all the screws start coming loose. We've seen things on that table that we're going to go up into space, where if you put it at a certain frequency, you literally just start to see screws start coming out of things. So, that's another one to think about. There will also be product-specific standards. Like if you have an EEG, for example, there'll be a whole slew of tests on top of the EMC and the safety and the risk management for that specific product. We have a chart at the lab of dozens of them, but I would say there's probably like 5 or 6 that are, you know, the most common ones to think about. Yeah, so I kind of went over this. Not designing the product with certification in mind is a mistake. Selecting uncertified components. This is a big one. So it's fine when you're working. People ask sometimes, like, when's the best time to engage with us? I would say when you have an idea, but best for testing is when you have like a first version prototype. So if you have a first version prototype and you don't have like so that's a UR mark actually. So there's UL, which probably people see a lot on products, but for certified components, you might want to look for a UR mark to make sure that somebody has done the actual testing on that component, so it's acceptable to put in as part of your system. Because if you show up with a final version of a product with, say, a power supply that doesn't have a UR mark or a bunch of internal components in DOTE, we'll look at it right away and say, like, just don't start, right? Because we're going to fail you right away if that's the case. So there's lots of examples of people showing up, oh, I bought this power supply, but it's not a medical grade power supply. Oh, this is a home use device. I forget what the rule is, whether it's 3-prong or 2, but it's 2. So if they show up with a 3-prong, one for medical use, you're not going to pass. And if you ordered a billion of those, plugs, that puts you in a really bad spot. So you want to think about all this stuff and as early on as possible. So this leads to avoidable failures and delays the earlier that you think about it and address it. This one was a big one a couple years ago. Selecting an unapproved lithium ion battery. So let's say you might have a medical device that doesn't even plug into the wall. It just has a lithium ion battery. So there's not a lot that can go wrong, like a mains powered device, but I'm sure you've heard all the stories. The batteries themselves can be dangerous. So what might happen is, if you're not in the industry, you don't know this, you'll say, okay, well, the guy I'm buying this from in Asia says that it's compliant, right? So says it's compliant and is compliant are two different things. The standard in there is IEC 62133. Sometimes you'll buy a pack And the cell has IEC 62133, but the pack doesn't have it, right? So then you would have to do that yourself, which you probably want to avoid. Testing batteries going to cost thousands of dollars. It takes a really long time to do. If you're not a battery expert, you won't be able to address any of the problems as they arise. So it's best, get a test report from the manufacturer that has a certificate showing that it's in compliance, and maybe it has like a UL, CSA, etc. mark. So I get a lot of emails about this, so I always just tell people, you know what, send me the report, because they're very tricky with their wording sometimes. Complies with blah, blah, blah doesn't mean the same as, oh, I looked it up, your serial number on the UL database. Yeah, it's legit because I can see this was tested at Shenzhen factory XYZ by Joe Schmo, and it shows up as a listed certified battery. So that's caused people a lot of problems in the past because they ordered them and then they couldn't find a battery that worked after they found out this one wasn't approved. So they had to pay all the money to get it approved. And the worst thing is what happens if you do that and it still fails and you can't pass it because you didn't design the battery. So that's one that's a big warning that we let people know about. High leakage currents. You can read that yourself, but that's one that's come up for a lot of people. So we do some pre-tests sometimes on safety just to look for those things. It's relatively affordable, which brings me to, that's 2 slides later. Mechanical testing, also a thing to think about. Something real simple. Let's say you're making a medical cart. This has happened a couple times. There's actually, so the bottom one there is a stability test. So you actually have to have a certain width of the legs, and you have to pass a tip test. So I don't remember what degree it's at, but if you tip it over just a little bit and it falls and crashes, it's a fail. So you have to have like a wide base, and there's actually like medical grade bases. Also, it says there's medical grade wheels as well. So that could just be something, you wouldn't think about that necessarily unless you've done it a whole bunch of times, and you could bring it in and then right away the engineer will say, well, you got the wrong wheels. You can't pass with those wheels. You have to go back and resource new wheels. And if you planned on being ready for testing in 2 weeks from now, guess what? Now you're not, because you got to go and find a new supplier for wheels and make sure they're acceptable. So another common one. For EMC testing for medical devices, one good thing is that you can actually determine the pass-fail criteria. So if it was another device like we call IT equipment, the standard says here's the limit for what's allowed. But yours with medical devices, there's a little leeway. As long as it doesn't interfere with the essential performance, there's ways to call something a pass. So I'll give you an example. You have a hospital bed on an EMC chamber, and we load it with 500 pounds. And we put it in and we start zapping the device with radiated immunity. If the little LED readout that says 500 pounds flickers for a second, can you live with that? Okay, so a lot of people would say, yeah, I can live with that. If it shuts off totally and doesn't show the weight, that's in anyone's mind a fail, right? Because that's a safety hazard. It's not showing how much weight is on there. So something to think about when you're thinking about EMC testing. So how to avoid all these? Something that people still bypass sometimes, and I don't know why, because by spending a little bit of money up front, you can save yourself weeks, months, and tens of thousands of dollars. So something we call pre-compliance. So for safety construction review, we'll take a look at a prototype. We don't necessarily even do any testing. We'll just open it up and look at it. And then we can write a one-pager on red flags on this device. So don't proceed until you address these red flags. And it might be oh, your plastic doesn't have a proper flame rating. It might be we found out the lithium-ion battery is not pre-approved. Could be any number of things. So that's a pretty affordable service. We're charging clients about $1,800 or $2,000 for that. I know it's not nothing if you're a startup, but it's a lot better to find out now about a little issue than spend a lot more later on in the future. Same thing we do with EMC pre-scans is, let's say there's 8 or 9 EMC tests that go on in the anechoic chamber. There's 2 that have the highest failure rate. So we'll rent out the EMC chamber for a half day. We're charging about $1,500 with an engineer the whole time with you. Full day is $25. We'll run those tests so that you know what your baseline is. So if you pass them, it doesn't mean you pass all the tests later on. It's kind of like taking an SAT. I took a practice SAT. I did really well. I think I'm kind of prepared for this. Doesn't mean on the big day I'll get it, but it's you're doing your due diligence. So that's something to consider too, relatively affordable. And, the chance of us finding something that on a prototype are very high. And then you can go back and fix it and you have a better chance of passing later on. So yeah, like the failure rates without pre-compliance for some things are 50%, and with maybe it's like lower around 20%. So it's a good thing to engage with. So that's the end of my hardware section. Any questions now, or feel free. Like, I know we're going to be walking around at lunch and stuff, and some people did ask me EMC questions. I don't know if they want to save that for later on in the meeting, or if you want to throw your hand up now. Yep.
Just thinking, so lots of times I'll be working with a company and they have a demo unit that they're just sort of moving around and taking with them.
Yep.
And they'll get it spot tested just once.
Yep.
Versus getting sort of proper testing like this. And I'm just curious, in your mind, when does the balance sort of shift from getting a unit spot tested to getting sort of standards like this approved?
So I would say probably once you put it on the market. So that means either whether you sell it or you're using it for a clinical trial or something like that. So once someone's actively engaged in using the product, you should go through and do some testing. Now, some people might, you said, want to start off with a pre-scan, but if you're going to put it in a hospital or someone's using it, you should probably do the full thing at that point. But that's very common. And we're not the police of this stuff. We're the lab that does it. We know the rules, but it's not like we're here to hammer them on you and tell you must do this. It's a business case, right? If you're only selling one unit somewhere, for a demo, you're probably not going to spend tens of thousands of dollars to do everything on it, right? So it's partly a business decision at some point too.
I'd add to that. There's also, how does this fit into your overall business plan, in the sense of, if you've got a risky device and investors are questioning whether you're going to make it to get compliance, doing that pre-compliance testing means that you've engaged at some level, and that adds to the credibility of certain product lines. I also, just like David said, there's a ranked ordered list of tests. So in general, depending on the environments you're expecting to demo in, the last thing you want to do is when a hospital invites you to present in their, mock operating room, you don't want to accidentally turn something else off, right? And so I think there's definitely the technical risk, but also the business risk that you want to consider when you make that decision. That spot test, if that's SP3000, there's different scopes and different things, and I'm happy to talk to you after about it.
There's different phases of when you're going to get the testing done for the maturity of the design as well too. If you're in prototype and your skins on your device change, then changing the industrial design of your device on the outer skins of the device is going to change the EMC profile as well. So every time you have a design change, you're probably going to have to go in for retesting.
Yeah, some amount. It depends. Something cosmetic is nothing. A little thing might be a pre-scan. If you're changing a power supply on something, that pretty much throws, all the emissions stuff out the window and has to be done again. You had a question?
Yeah, I guess twofold to just mention. One is, because of this, I was just looking over what you were saying. I can see all of those being the risk, even for a small device, everything from the IP rating to, I was what should be the level of acceptance? Let's say, for example, speaking class 1 device, class 2 device. So it depends on what you're doing, but how far should we go, or what would be the percentage of risk management, or as I say, cost of a device that we should take into account? And this I'm just talking more of the best practice, not saying specific one device or whatever, but it seems like a lot that you have to comply with. Yeah. And and I was just thinking when about the wheels and say medical grade. We start creeping in terms of the cost of the device. So where should we, or is there a best practice, say we do pre-compliance and say these are things you need to focus on. These are stuff that really is not as valuable, let's say, on the overall risk profile of the devices. And I guess the second part of it is just in general, when for anyone who's building a device, what percentage what cost factor we should assume? Let's say we want to work, what would be, I'm assuming it depends on the device, but overall, what's the percentage we have to put into testing?
Sure. So I'll answer the first one. So when we do a construction review, there's different levels. The level 1 is just basically look at things against the standard and find out some problems. We would talk to the client though and say like, what specific things are you worried about? Like how much research have you done and what are you worried about? So sometimes we'll do just the basic construction review, but then Vic will say, oh, I think you should do a leakage test. I think you should do this test. Oh, it's a medical cart. Let's try the tip test. So we kind of like talk with you about it, and you know the device better than us, or you should. And we'll say, what things are you concerned about? Do you want to do an a la carte thing where you pick some tests? Some clients for EMC will have something that you're commonly touching, and they'll say, oh, okay, other than radiated emissions and immunity, I want to do electrostatic discharge, right? Like I'm walking around with my fuzzy slippers in the winter. You touch electronics, zap, bad for electronics. So some people will have like, that's in my mind. So we'll say, great, we'll throw in like an ESD test you can do too. As far as pricing is concerned, that's a hard one to answer, and I'll give you the honest answer. It's like, it could be, if you want a Ferrari, it costs as much as a Ferrari. So what we mean by in that sense is the more standards you have, right, the higher the cost is. So on the high end of medical device testing is $100,000 plus. So you got radios, maybe multiple radios talking to each other, EMC, safety, IP testing, home use, some additional what we call -2 standards. On the lower end, you're probably talking about like $40,000 to $50,000. So less standards. I don't use it at home. I don't have a radio on it. I don't have a laser on it. So basically, I think that's the closest way I can honestly answer that question. Yeah. So there's a range. High end, 100,000 plus. Lower end, $40,000, $50,000. And we're talking just testing, right? Not some of the other things that are involved in making a device. I think I've kind of gone over my time, but I'm going to be around and I'll be back there later. So at lunch, if anyone just wants to walk by and ask me questions, feel free. And I'm going to hand it over to Kirusha.
So thank you, David, for giving such a detailed talk on something I'm super passionate about as well, as has been. The world of electromagnetic compatibility is like the weird, wonderful mix of science and reality. I'm going to talk about building a medical device company. My goal today is to give you a taster palette of what it's like to do this day in and day out. There are lots of topics that I could cover. And so I built this in a way that we can hit a lot of things, but have like a conversation. So the first thing I want to do is get a sense of the room. So how many of you are actively involved in like a medical device related project right now? Okay, wonderful. Amongst those of you, how many are you kind of in the research project phase, like before you've incorporated? Wonderful. And how many of you are part of a medical device company? Fantastic. Amongst the research projects, does someone want to share what they're working on?
Yeah, I can share. So we're building biosensors, which can provide women with more information on their hormone level through menopause.
Wonderful. And does anyone else want to share? And your name is?
Aditi.
Aditi. Thank you, Aditi. Is there anyone else from the research camp? From the medical device product company camp, does someone want to share what they do? I'm not going to move until someone does.
Yeah, so we're working on a wearable to actually monitor seniors in their homes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And your name is?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I want to hear your stories. I've got a lot of questions. And my intention is to build on the answers you give me in the way that, as experts, we're here to make you go faster, not necessarily telling you what to do, but in my case, it's helping you do the work. There are lots of advisory programs that exist to say, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this. But Mega Studio and the division that I run, we're focused on getting you to those endpoints by helping you do the work. And so Mega Studio is a venture studio that partners with healthcare professionals to transform medical device ideas to commercially available medical devices. Our initial scope was, in fact, just clinicians, But due to the abundance of supports needed within our community here in Southern Ontario, and nationally here in Canada, we've expanded to offer these services to other groups as well. Our goal is to take our ideas from concept to market, working with companies where they are in a way that's meaningful to them. And the more complicated, the better. As you kind of heard from David, we really like to kind of move with the Ferrari kind of situation, which is the last device that I was the head of engineering for prior to joining Megalab was the Thornhill Research, or Thornhill Medical's SLC, which is a 9-in-1 combination device and probably has more particulars than any other device in Canada. So we're not afraid. And so how do we help? So in-house, we support moving from getting to early concepting, providing business development plans, funding support, development planning, quality and regulatory strategy and execution, as well as testing. We work with our execution development partners to execute on detailed design. We've got friends who do low volume manufacturing, which is really important. Medical devices require low volume, high quality, which generally manufacturers do not want to do. But because Megalabs has been and the members of our team have been in the game for quite a while, we have leverage with low volume, high quality manufacturing. Marketing, reimbursement analysis, I'm just touching on this one right now. And then one that, a lot of us need to think about at one time or another is M&A planning. So understanding how do we position companies well for the right step to bring those ideas to the wider market. Yes, direct sales is possible. I come from Synaptive. We had a direct sales team. But M&A for many companies allows for higher access to the marketplace and naturally the distribution that comes with that. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit throughout about our bootcamp program, which we've recently launched to help companies kind of take that leap of quick maturation. And so our bootcamp is a 2-day program that we basically only have room for about 6 companies in this season, where we sit with a company and we go through a detailed version of some of the things we've gone through today to kind of get them organized and on the path to becoming mega studio company. And so if you'd like to learn more about our bootcamp, feel free to drop me an email, and my email will exist later on. And so we're going to start with laying the foundation. And so I'm not going to read this out loud, but this is the Health Canada definition of what is a medical device. And so knowing your definitions and knowing what your device is with respect to those definitions is something that as a founder or a partner within a medical device company, don't take that for granted. Don't rely on someone else to know what those basic definitions are, because they vary. There's also the definition according to the FDA. So an instrument, an apparatus, an implementation, machine, contrivance, implant, or in vitro reagent, that's in use for the diagnosis of disease or other conditions. And it includes animals in the case of the FDA. And so there's always a question of, is what I'm working on a medical device? And that's one that you should take a moment and make sure that you come up with the correct language. It is a medical device because as per this section it is, or it is not. And what exactly does diagnosis mean? What exactly is a mitigation or prevention of disease? The reason why I'm lingering here is because what experts do is we come up with a plan that's defensible, that provides a truthful classification of these devices with respect to regulation. But you'll realize that we're all human beings. The regulators are human beings. And the way that we present our case to them will really dictate how they feel about our devices. If we tell them that they're risky and they're uncontrolled risks, they're not going to approve our devices. The frameworks of the FDA, Health Canada, EU MDR exist to protect the public. And so knowing the language or working with individuals who do allow for you to come up with the best way possible in terms of that interpretation. So I'm going to start with kind of the formula. And I know that some of you are already part of medical device companies, but I really think that it's worth kind of thinking about in this format. Both from an investment perspective, a scalability perspective, and understanding how does your business make decisions. Every week, I receive at least 5 different pitch decks. And I'm surprised that sometimes they lack 2, maybe 3 of these things. And I'll start with, and in the subsequent slides, we'll talk about it more. But starting with a vision of the future, whether it is, a future where drawing blood is not as painful as it is, so that individuals who have fears or discomfort about entering a lab environment can be there and exist so that we can actually treat them. That could be a vision for a future. They can be grand, they can be simple, but they need to be explainable. And I think in some ways that's almost as important as the idea. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Because if you have a vision for your future and you recognize along the journey that you can't quite do exactly what you wanted to in terms of an idea, the rest of what you've created is still worth something if you have a vision that you can tie to. So at Synaptive, I think I had 4 jobs. I started as the technology transfer engineer for R&D algorithms group right when I was 22. I was in charge of bringing technology made in other industries inbound to Synaptive product lines. And then I became an electrical engineer and a senior electrical engineer. And at one point I spent something like 62 days at the test facility. And so when David is saying that, he's not joking. I might be like in a pink dress, but I spent a lot of time just actually getting devices to pass. And so moving on to the team, it's really important at any point, even after you've formulated, who your co-founders are, etc., to always be checking where your blind spots are. Do you have the right attributes in order to kind of succeed, and why and how you believe that? What is your actual plan to make this a venture? Almost every pitch deck I see, the plan part is the most foggy, and not very much evidence is given as to why that plan is worth buying into. It's usually a rhyme and list of saying, I'm going to build the product, it's going to cost me this much, I'm going to send it to trial, it's going to cost me this much. But understanding who, what, where, when, and why in the plan is super important. And the last one, and I'm so glad to be here at Western Research Parks, like partners. So, as members of the Western community, you have access to different organizations that can help you kind of accelerate and learn so that you can focus on the parts that you're good at and the parts that you need to grow at. But also it lends credibility when you work with other groups. I don't think we've ever invested in companies who are just one individual that did all of the work. In fact, most times that's quite concerning to us. And so I hope that this is an okay pace. Let me know if you would like me to speed up. But, specific to medical device companies as we evaluate them, because this is really important. I'm always looking for, are these individuals flexible? This is beyond understanding the technical know-how, but are they flexible? If I were to say, if I were to say, well, how would you make this smaller? Would they question me, or would they try to explain this, or would they provide a reasonable answer? Do they show up consistently? I think anyone who's been in entrepreneurship mindset or in a project recognizes how important it is to actually show up every day. Occasionally, a client drops off at Megalab, and we have a lot of questions. And all of us, we worry a little bit when they don't show up consistently, because even if you're having bad days and bad times, we'd rather hear from you. Communication skills are super important, and a positive outlook. It sounds super cheesy, but most of my life in the workspace has been in life support systems, end stage brain cancer surgery. And so being able to have a positive outlook, no matter what's going on, not saying that you need your, the pie in the sky, but being able to say, there is a path for me to move forward with this particular idea. I still have a vision, even if I've experienced a setback, etc. Genuine curiosity. Many of you that are on this path will be reading lots of technical papers. If you're not curious, and I don't sense that you're curious to find out what comes next, it's going to be difficult. And so making sure that the curiosity part, as you go from being a research project to a product, and you think you're going to be all serious and kind of stringent, there's lots of standards, but keeping that mindset of being curious, wanting to learn some more, being open to new ideas is really important. And genuine passion. I would say in all of the decks that I've read and all the people I've met, I can sense when someone is passionate about what they're doing. And it's with that those are the main things that I wanted to go through there. How many of you have heard of RWW? So this was first introduced to me at Hopkins. I stole it. I don't think it was Hopkins that invented it. But there is a framework for new product development called RWW. And you're answering three main things when it comes to deciding if this is a product that you want to build. Is it a good thing to go forward? Is there a good no-go decision here? So the first question is it real? Repeat this after me. Is it real? Come on, say it with me.
Is it real?
Is it real? And it's really important to go from having a generalized idea of how the world is, saying, is this a real problem? Do people actually have it? This is the first knock that whether I'm going to close the deck and move on and do something else, if I don't believe the problem is real. And so as a founder, your responsibility is not just to tell other people that it's real, but to actually make sure it is. Are people actually dropping surgical tools all over the floor? Are people actually leaving cotton swabs, cotton balls inside people's skulls? This is a real thing. And looking at how do you demonstrate whether your idea is based on a real problem. And then the second one, can we win? Can we win is a really important thing to consider, because just because a problem exists doesn't necessarily mean that we are the team to do it. And maybe we aren't, but we need to understand what it would take to win. So does this mean, do I have the knowledge, the know-how, the access to a lab? One of the things that David hinted at was, a year ago, I came to Megalab and I said, I think that we could do more as a lab. I've done a lot of work with a lot of companies, and I think we can do more. And I did this because I thought we could win. I was like, I've got a team that I've worked with in lots of different ways, and we have access to the resources. We have 100 medical device companies already involved with testing. And I think that even though this is not something they've done before, I think that there's a high possibility we can win. And so does that one make sense? Does everyone kind of understand what it means to define whether you can win or not? I think a lot of companies overestimate whether they can win. And that's that's difficult, right? To say that, you know what, maybe we can't win because the regulation is too difficult. Maybe we can't win because the procurement pathways are not clear. But being honest with yourself and saying, well, can we, is really important, because unlike a research project, a medical device company is something that other people are going to invest in, and they're going to want ROI, they want return on investment. At some point, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but if they put $10 in, they're going to want $100 out eventually. And so I'm not saying to quit before you've done all the things, but asking yourself, can I win? And if I can't, what do I need to do? Who do I need to partner with? What conversations do I need to have in order to win is really important. And the last one is it worth it? And yes, you can look at this as a floaty question, like it is worth it because someone will be helped. There's lots of things I do just because of that. Like, is it worth it? But you have to look at it, is it worth it as a business, as a medical device company? Like, let's say you want to make, surgical linens for a specific purpose, or certain surgical gauze or surgical bandages. And you've identified that if it was real, that the issue is real, and you've identified that you can win. But is it worth it is a question of, like, if everything went well, would you make money? A lot of founders don't think about that. Like, will they make enough money? Will the work-life balance of your team actually look good if you win? Like, what does the future look like for you? Will your business have to give up parts of itself in order to make this product win? Is it worth it? There are products and projects I've been on that at some point one of these things did not work out. And that's when you have those go, no-go decisions. And that's why I asked you kind of to repeat them to yourself, because as you evaluate, as you work in groups and meet other founders, just ask yourself, is this real? Can they win? If they can't, are you going to ask them some questions about whether it's actually real or whether they can actually win? And then, is it worth it is like a really important question, because yes, you could, make purple ketchup. Does anyone remember purple ketchup? Okay, like at one point in the late 90s, early 2000s, some Heinz made purple ketchup. I didn't understand whether it was real, what they were going to win, or whether it was worth it. Maybe it was just a marketing fad. I think it was. And so I want to talk a little bit about the differences between a research project versus medical device company. I put an arbitrary line in the sand a few minutes ago and said, like, have you incorporated? Is that a bar for whether it's a medical device company? But you know what? The reality is many research projects incorporate and they claim they're a medical device company, but I wouldn't qualify them as that. Because you're not a company until you have a path to make revenue as a business. You have a sense of what the reimbursement might look like, who the provider and payer are. There's a lot of language that comes to mind. A research project is generally funded through grants and other like nonprofit organizations, while a medical device company is often, investor-led or founder-led companies. And the shareholders kind of determine how a medical device company's direction will be taken. While a research project is generally led by, a principal investigator who's kind of investigating a certain area. There are different consequences of failing when you're a research project versus a medical device company. And failure is, it's disappointing regardless. But one piece of advice I give everyone is to spend some time to understand, if you've spun out a company, what's changed? How did you kind of say, okay, now I'm a company? Or at what point is it right to incorporate? Those are questions that we sit down one-on-one and kind of work through. And so the main phases of a medical device company, I'm going to talk a lot about clinical needs assessment, concept definition, feasibility analysis, kind of detailed design and development, design verification, validation, reg submissions, manufacturing scale-up, commercial launch, and post-market surveillance. I don't want to put you guys to sleep, so I'm going to take a moment and ask the question, how many of you have done a clinical needs assessment? I'm hoping that all of you that are running medical device companies have done a clinical needs assessment, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The other random tidbit I'll lay to this slide is how many of you have heard of a Q-sub meeting with the FDA? Okay, wonderful. So the immediate next section is on the clinical needs assessment, but I'm going to stop and talk a little bit about a Q-sub meeting with the FDA. A lot of people think that you kind of put together a regulatory submission and you throw it over the fence. And if it's a 510K class 2 device with a predicate, that you eventually just hear from them so that you now have authorization to sell. That's like a lot of people kind of go down the 510K path with the FDA, and this is kind of how they go forward with that. The Q submission process is a process that allows you to kind of test the waters with the FDA. And I'm not talking about Health Canada in this minute, but similar things kind of exist with Health Canada. But there's an opportunity, if you fill out a document, that you can take your idea, that you've gone through certain motions, and then you can book a meeting with the FDA, and you can show them the verification validation plans. You can show them the proposed test protocol. You can show them the trial design that you're looking at pursuing for your first ingredient, and you can get some feedback from them. That's not assurance that they're going to accept all of that, but I think a lot of people think about regulatory as this is paperwork that I need to kind of check off. And while the FDA, they're not meant to, tell companies exactly what they need to do at all times, they do provide a lot of insight into how they're going to evaluate their file. And the riskier a device, and I like my devices risky, the sooner they know about you, the sooner you're along a path where they're interacting with you on an occasional basis, the lower the risk that something brand new is going to show up in an unexpected stage or phase. And it's also really good for demonstrating traction, because if you're walking around with a concept, as someone mentioned, one of their partner companies are doing, to say that you've booked a Q submission meeting with the FDA, it means something. It means that you've taken the first main step in order to kind of go down that path. While it isn't in itself an approval of any kind, it's something that adds to credibility. And as a medical device company, it's really important to build that as you move forward. And so, one of the things we work on with our studio companies is, where is the cost coming from at every stage of your business? There is this, I'm a professional engineer, and I was hardwired to start by trying to build as much as I can with the skills that I can to build a prototype so that I could use that in order to demonstrate my idea. That was what I was brought up professionally to do. But that's not really how I do this anymore. I start with a good set of requirements that are coming in from different angles. I'm setting my phases based on what I'm trying to prove at each level of each stage of what a company is. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. But the reason I wanted to stop and talk about Business Planning 101 is it's really easy to get caught up in saying, well, I need to do a detailed design right now. I need to come up with an enclosure. Somebody told me this, I need to do this. The feedback from the clinician last week was to implement this feature. Guess what? I have the ability to code that. I can 3D print that. I can move fast, move quickly, and kind of get some traction this way. And I'm not saying that you can't do it that way. But I think that in the last 10 years, I've kind of pivoted a little bit. Where is the cost coming from is not just about dollar cost. Cost is also time. Where are you putting your time at each stage? Where are your co-founders, the other people involved? What is using the resource in each stage is something that we work with you on. And I challenge you to think about. And how is that cost being funded? Here in Canada, we have a lovely SR and ED program. We have lots of NSERC IRAP money, but recognizing, okay, I'm going to take it to this phase, and then we'll be at TRL, blah, blah, blah. And based on that, this is how the time cost is being funded. This is how the dollar cost is being funded. And then how is the work expanding our credibility and traction towards our goal at each phase? Yes, we talk about that in, big tranches, but I challenge you to talk about that at a feature level. When we're talking about implementing a feature, is just putting a slide of what that feature is good enough to go to a doctor and explain it and get what you need out of it? Or do you need to implement it? Because I'm always looking for the lowest cost, highest effectiveness means. Because in many cases, being an effective communicator means that you can negotiate a large number of stakeholders and consolidate that into a few system requirements that you can then implement quickly, as opposed to creating many, many diverging designs. So I think you probably guessed that I'm a big planner. And so with Mega Studio, this is kind of an example process that we follow, where if we're working with a physician founder, we kind of have someone doing the technical project management and someone doing the clinical product management. And that's because it's always good to have someone independently chasing the timelines while someone is independently managing what does this product look like. And so in that pre-planning, in both the pre-planning and the preliminary venture plan development, we're taking that idea and creating that 2-pager, that summary of what is the value proposition of doing this, what's the vision, what's the rough device classification, what do we think the time to market may look like, etc. And then we go to de-risking. So we look at the riskiest parts, not just from a product function perspective, but the risk with the compliance or with trials, etc. We try to look at that and look at what opportunities we can do to share the risk with others, to reduce the risk if possible, or be able to justify taking that risk. And I think these are like key pillars, because a lot of people who are, in that medical device startup business, they don't really get through that phase to get to that detailed venture plan. They either skip some phases and they try to build a business or build a product, but they haven't done the due diligence. So they spend 18 months of money, time, and fundraising is typically what I see. The rest of it, I call it like standard stuff that we work with. We can do pre-submission, we can do testing, we can do commercial setup support, etc. And I think that the rest of the slide is really just process-based. Quickly going to the vision. I think it's really important when I review a deck is like, is this based on a lived experience either of the co-founder or someone else that's close to the business? Because too often at a time, as an engineer, I see an engineer who's like, I think this would be good for catheters. I'm like, how do you know? Whose lived experience is this based on? I see people nodding a lot. And it doesn't have to be your own, but you need to have a close tie, and that's one of the reasons why our studio is really focused in that clinical base. Is it easy to understand? I'm not saying that complicated problems are not worth solving, but it should be easy for individuals to understand why they should care about your vision. And simplifying it, trying it on a few different people, not just your product idea, but also your vision. And will the stakeholders support it? I'll give you an example of a device where this device requires 1/10 of the pharmaceutical dose that's typically used in conjunction with that device. The pharma companies are also a stakeholder in this, because now only 1/10 of a dose of their drug is going to be used along with this device, which might be complicated from a support perspective, right? I'm not saying that one thing's good or bad, but recognizing, okay, who are your stakeholders and are they aligned with our vision? And figuring out ways to say, well, if we can do 1/10 of the dose for the drug company, well, maybe more people will be willing to take the drug, right? Like looking at it and spinning at it right at that vision stage. Again, it sounds a little hokey, but it really helps, because when you're in those really complicated multi-stakeholder decisions, one thing I love to do is get everyone aligned, because once everyone's agreeing that we want a common good future, it's much easier for us to agree on the little bits. And so a clinical needs assessment is something that I'm going to talk about. I mean, the first thing I meant to do is ask, does someone know what a clinical needs assessment is? Go ahead.
So that is my understanding is to do a check basically on what is the requirement for, in a setting, like what's the requirement from patient side of it, from what is going to be used for, how it's going to be, what's the requirement from, and can be multiple stuff, can be like who needs it, how they would need it, how do we use it, to everything else of who's going to be the main user, who's going to be, and how we're going to do testing on this. There's a bunch of stuff that fits into that, but that's my general understanding of it.
So I think you summed it up well. The way I value a clinical needs assessment is saying, well, as a medical device, it's going to suit a performance purpose somewhere. So where does that fall? Who's starting with the clinical workflow as it is today? Like doctors, clinicians, technologists, researchers, whomever people in the home trying to perform this action, what are they currently using? Like before I get to a solution of your device, just like what is the current workflow that's happening? Now, where are the pain points or the gain points that could be gotten from that workflow? The first thing people do incorrectly is they ask one doctor, they ask 3 doctors, or they ask a nurse, what is the workflow you use? The reality is there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of segmentation that you need to do of a marketplace to get good data when it comes to a clinical needs assessment. You can check and see what's considered the gold standard online. Like you can look at what is Health Canada or CMS saying that what is this procedure consist of? Like there's even looking at Medicare, Medicaid in America, there's like, okay, if this person comes in with chest pain, this is the workup that the insurance will pay for. This stuff exists. And just thinking about, okay, what is that existing workflow? And making sure you have a balanced understanding of the biases that are being introduced at this point. Because really early on, when you're trying to form what are you going to do, you really need to figure out whether the people who've told you that information, what biases they have. That doesn't necessarily mean that's good or bad, but recognizing that someone who works at a large institution as a internal medicine doctor is going to have a very different clinic experience than someone in a rural health setting. They might be doing 20 different things, or they might have 5 different staff. They might not even know what the full process is because they're only interacting with a portion of the process. And when we're doing that clinical needs assessment, we need to document that meaningfully. I think it's starting with the real problem. So we talked about an unmet need or an inadequate need. The second thing I look for is practicality. Sure, you can build a device that does X, Y, Z, but is it practical? Is a nurse actually going to be wheeling this cart around? What would they otherwise be doing? These are like practical related questions. Clinical expertise, like we always look when we evaluate a business, who is driving the clinical perspective here? Is it an individual? Is it a clinician? And how do we know that they have credibility for this? When I speak to founders and they say, I'm making a better glucose monitor, or I'm making a smarter dialysis machine, I say, so what's your billing code? It's like for partial body PET, it's $1,400. That's how much the hospital is getting reimbursed every time they scan a patient, if they bill it correctly to Medicare. Without too many Canadian startups don't understand how medical billing works. And therefore, they might build a product that no hospital can buy because it doesn't fit the actual means that those people providing care are actually getting the money to operate their facility. Understanding whether your device is a capital purchase or if it's going to be absorbed as part of the slush fund of a department is worthwhile and worth noting. And I've got another quiz question. Does anyone know what a VAC is? Okay, a VAC is a value analysis committee. And so once you have a device and it's in the process of being evaluated for purchase at a hospital, it will be presented by a clinical champion from that department that's looking to make that purchase to a value analysis committee, which will then evaluate what the ROI is for that hospital. They'll look at how many cases they do, how many centers they have, and whether this is of value to them. And it's often compared to all the other hospital departments that are pitching for that same money. Regulatory alignment is super important because essentially if you're building something, you really need to know how is the regulator going to treat this? Is it a de novo? Is it, do you need a PMA to do this? Are there pre-existing predicate devices? And something I look for that Megalabs looks for is a commitment to development. So like you have an idea, but it's a lot of work to go from idea to real product. And how committed are you to this idea? Sometimes I'll say, maybe you should scale it back to something that you can commit to. You know, this sounds very mean to say, but you know, I can't commit to curing cancer, but I'm still working on that, right? And so understanding what piece can we carve out in order to kind of get there is super important. I'm going to fly through a few more slides. I know that we want to take a quick break and then go to Vince. But I want to kind of like give you dig a little deeper questions. I ask often, is it actually an unmet need? Like, why hasn't this been done before? And then again, I'll say, are you sure it hasn't been done before? Because in many cases, it has been done before, but maybe not well. Maybe it was the wrong time, but I try to dig deeper. How are they filling the gap now? Because it's hard pressed for me to believe that they're doing absolutely nothing about this. And again, why hasn't this been done before? How would the clinical workflow change as a result of this? And is that acceptable? And how have you proven that? So these are all questions that we prep our companies with answers for. So we're sitting there trying to figure that out with them. And they're very diverse in terms of what's going on with them. And so 4 quick ways to get answers, not quick, but 4 ways. Proper user identification and segmentation. So knowing the difference between the needs of a resident doctor at a teaching hospital versus a clinic, an outpatient clinic in rural Ontario. 2, workflow mapping, journey mapping for each of those types of users to understand whether this device makes sense for that space. voice of stakeholder interviews. I'm going to stop and talk about this. A lot of people say, well, I got clinician feedback on this. It means very little to me. Everybody does it. But I want to know which questions you asked, and were they consistent? And what did you glean? What was the insight that was learned? Because gathering feedback, in a case study I recently did for Johns Hopkins, we were talking about how a company that was doing whole wheat pasta was going to try to enter the pizza market. Well, the frozen pizza market's very, very fragmented. Well, there's only like 6 brands of pasta in the grocery store, and you have a whole aisle of pizzas. And so recognizing that in your voice of stakeholder interviews, just by asking a question in a different way, you might get a different answer. So I call that sensitivity analysis of your voice of customer. So I may ask you to go back with a slightly different wording and see if they still agree to that question. And consulting key databases. This is like a subject level mastery that I want more people to know. How many of you have heard of MAUDE? So MAUDE is actually the database where you can look at all of the adverse event reporting of the FDA. And so if you type in battery fires, you can find out all of the different battery fires that have happened. Or like dialysis machine failures. You can find out all of the adverse events that were reported. This is great data for mining to understand what kind of risks you may need to mitigate, identify, etc. Like, it's public information how often certain billing codes are used. So if you do a reimbursement analysis and you find out that 15455 whatever is your billing code, you can find out how many times somebody billed that last year. You can even probably, I think, find out which doctor did that billing. And so that's a really good backwards way of finding out which centers, which types of centers are actually kind of doing the work that you wish to participate in, that you want your product to go. I hope I'm not boring you to death. And so I really want to talk about gathering more useful feedback. I do a lot, like going from being a technology transfer engineer to a senior design engineer to a manager of engineers to now vice president overseeing this division. I think the most important thing I would say is like learn to get better feedback, to build traction, to build more useful devices. 2 questions that I want to leave you with from hospital CEOs. Are actually, this is the polite way of putting it, but especially American hospital CEOs have 2 main drivers. One is your device a cost saver? That could be time cost, it could be resource cost, etc. And how does it bring in revenue? Like, how does the hospital make more money as a result of this? And the cost savings could be a drop in readmissions. The revenue could be that they can bill more, right? It's a very different game. But essentially, if you can't answer those 2 questions, and unfortunately many companies, Canadian bred, don't know how to answer these, it's really important. And the third I added in there, the hospital CEO did not say this one, but how easy is it to deploy? So once you have this product, how difficult is it to bring that on board? In reality, how difficult is it to connect to PACS? How difficult is it to pull down data? How many different systems need to talk to one another for that magic platform to work? And so I've got slides on early feasibility. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this, but again, focus on sensitivity, pushing answers and understanding whether am I presenting this in a way that they would answer consistently. 3 important areas that I really would want you to focus on are constructing instructions for use, system requirements and risk management. Happy to talk to you about this after the break. Who should I engage? Here's a good list of the different external stakeholders, some standards that you need to follow. Happy to talk later about regulatory requirements and funding. Here's just for the deck, having a sense of like, here are the major building blocks during early product development. And then I'm gonna fly through this and say, if you'd like to come to our boot camp, we have 6 slots left. Feel free to take a photo of this and drop me an email. Thank you so much. And again, I hope I didn't bore you.
So I'm going to talk more about the practical side of this whole quality management system thing and how we kind of actually apply the different tests and results of the tests and sort of what you expect to see. So one of the most important things is really execution of continuous improvement in a quality management system. So when I talk about quality management system, everybody knows like ISO 13485 and ISO 9001 and 14971. Is everybody familiar with those numbers and standards, right? The big difference really, I think you have to take home from this is 13485 is for medical devices and 9001 is for like, you know, basically everything else, right? If it's not something that it's a medical device, it has to actually have an ISO certification before it can go to market, before you put your first product into the marketplace. 9001, you can be well underway to a quality system, but you don't necessarily have to have the certification to be able to go to market, right? So, and we had talked about classifications and that sort of stuff before. For medical devices, there's, you know, class 1, class 2, class 3 medical devices. So things like examination gloves and swabs and that sort of thing might be class 1. You might not need to have a 1345 if you're exempt as a level 1 medical device. But if you're class 2 or class 3, where it's actually invasive. So the example I like to use is like for examination gloves that aren't actually going into the human body, right, might be a class 1 device. Whereas surgical gloves that are actually used in surgeries inside a human body, that would be like classified as a class 2 device. So that's sort of the differentiation between them. So on that note, always be under continuous improvement. Make sure that you're executing that continuous improvement. The whole concept of a quality management system is that you start off in a place and then you want to get better day by day at controlling your process and controlling your environment. What I like to use is something called the crawl, walk, run. So I work with a group called Epicor, which is a modular ERP system. Everybody familiar with enterprise resource planning and manufacturing resource planning and that sort of thing? So this is something that you're going to learn more and more about as you're scaling up your process. And I'll talk a little bit more scaling up in the way of dealing with that in the near future. So this crawl, walk, run approach is basically starting slow and then building at your own pace, your operational system. So this is a focus factory layout. So when I'm going in and doing an evaluation of a company, I'm going to take a look at the way they're actually manufacturing their device. So basically it comes in to the shipping dock. If we're talking about parts that are actually like going into a device that you're making, so you're going to have a process flow for accepting those things into your building, going in, making sure that they're clean, going into incoming inspection, making sure that they're meeting your specifications and your drawings, and that they're going into inventory. Okay. Is everybody familiar with part numbering? Because I've gone into a lot of companies that are actually like in operation, and I ask, how do you use your part numbers? And they say to me, what are part numbers? Right? So basically, making mass spectrometers, like in each one of these devices, it's like 12,000 different parts. And they all have to go together in a particular way. So you have to reference your engineering drawing, and you have to have part numbers for each one of those parts so that they fit together in assembly drawings and everything goes together in a particular type of way. So at the end of the day, you have a functioning device. And so each one of those parts, when they're sent out to vendors, they have to come into incoming inspection. So there's going to be a drawing with a part number that's going to be associated with those parts coming in. And it has to meet specifications to be able to go into your inventory. And if it doesn't meet specifications, then it goes into something called the corrective action process. So this is basically how the quality system works. So like I talked about, you're using ERP to be able to look at it. So what I usually do is manufacturing resource planning. I start off with a particular module. And the advantage for this company that I work with is their module. A lot of ERP companies like Oracle and SAP I've worked with in the past, they come in and they kind of sell you the whole bill of goods, and it costs a lot of money and it grinds your process to a halt. So you have to be very careful about doing that sort of thing. A lot of people think, well, I can just use spreadsheets, but you want your different departments working together, and it's easier to start out kind of slow and communicate with the different departments. So your accounting department is talking to your manufacturing department, is talking to your sales department, and you're regulating everything across the board, and you're growing the company as a cohesive unit rather than one company, one department doing one thing on a spreadsheet, and there's no communication from the different departments and nobody knows what everybody's doing in the long run. So there's these standards that we follow. Quality management standards, like I talked about, 9001, 1345, 14971 for risk management. So as medical device developers, you're worried about 1345 and 14971. If you're something like a mass spectrometer is actually not classified as a medical device. It's a in vitro diagnostic device. So it's on a different scale with the government of Canada. So that's something you have to be aware of too. Do you actually have a medical device or do you not? So process control plans, training matrix, continuous feedback, like I talked about your corrective action request. So here's what a corrective action process looks like. Do you need a corrective? Your part comes into the company and there's a discrepancy against the drawing. So you have to look at your corrective action process. And then it goes to your steering committee. You have your corrective action committee make sure that it's a problem with the drawing or a problem with the part or a problem with the vendor. And then you have to look at your drawing. If it's a problem with the drawing, then you have to do an ECN, an engineering change notice. So you have to make sure that all of those things that are wrong between the part and the drawing are corrected and they're taken into effect. So if you change everything in the engineering change drawing, then you can close the car. Now, basically it goes back to a product change notification, a PCA, and you have to make sure that all of your departments are doing the changes as required by the engineering change notice. And then that's a list of things to make sure that everything's happening according to plan. Software development, we talked a little bit about. We've done some work in SQA and that sort of thing. We actually do have a group that works with the ISO 27001. So there is a new standard now to make sure that your cybersecurity is in place, and it's something that we can help you with as well. So I had talked about a little bit before. Is everybody familiar with TRL levels, Technology Readiness Levels? Have anybody not worked in this environment before? So one thing we're working with different accelerators and that sort of thing are identifying the process to be able to get your products to market. So these are technology readiness levels. So the idea here is if you're sort of in ideation phase, then you're sort of like in level 1 or 2. What's the laser pointer on this? Doesn't matter. So when we're talking to people, here are the red marks are where regulatory affairs gets involved. And this is the TRL process here. So what we want to see is a prototype and a proof of concept. When we're initially doing our testing with EMC and product safety and these things that Dave had talked about before, we can talk to you up here. It's always a good idea to get regulatory affairs kind of involved in the process up front. Like we talked about pre-compliance testing, dealing with your critical components list and all that sort of stuff. It's better to get an understanding up here before you're actually starting to like do your part buying and all that sort of thing, because we're going to save you a lot of money. There's nothing worse than buying the wrong power supply, spending lots of money on the power supply, and then realizing you have to trash it because you don't have the proper power supply. Like a medical device power supply is different than a regular type power supply. And you have to be aware of that, and we can help you understand those components. But this is essentially the R&D phase. So you're doing the demo phase. We can help you here, get it into the EMC chamber, do the product safety, proof of concept, refine your design. What I had talked about before is like between your breadboard and your test bed phase, you have like prototype 1, 2, 3. Then you get into pilot phase, right? So pilot is when you've got maybe like 2 or 3 different prototypes that are built on like a beta phase design, where you've got sort of an industrial design incorporated into it. But if you're changing anything that might be related to EMC, you're going to have to redo that EMC testing because it might be affected by those design changes. Okay? So you're going through concept plan, design build, verification and validation. That's part of your regulatory design as well too. Then you get into pilot phase. With mass spectrometers, we used to build 6 different pilots at beta phase that would go out to clinical users and be able to determine whether they would do the proper testing and be able to use it in the field. We would also designate one for regulatory testing. So that would be the same design, same phase as everything else, but it would go to the regulatory testing phase to make sure that it would go through ship testing, ENC, product safety, so that it could ship halfway around the world and then still be in one piece when it got there. Because there's nothing worse than having a complex piece of technology like that flying out to Basel, Switzerland, and then, the instrument arrives, you open up the crate and there's ball bearings everywhere, like Dave was talking about earlier, right? Now I went skiing for 3 days, but that was kind of the downside of it, I guess. But then I had to wait for a week for the other one to show up so that I could install it and make it work properly. So if it doesn't go through that ship testing, if you're not sure of the design of the device, and especially the crate too, it's things like high-tech devices like this, you have to spend a lot of time on the design of the crate because you have to make sure that it actually arrives in one piece when it gets to your customer site, and especially if you're shipping all around the world. And these things go up in planes, and there's things you have to consider about condensation on electrical boards and all that sort of stuff as well too, which is something we can help you with. So in this phase, we help you understand where you are with your technology readiness level. We understand where we can help you get to market, and then we can help you deploy it to market. We work with companies like Boston Scientific and Stryker and that sort of thing as well too, so we can help you with sales and service channels and get your products to market. So all of this red area here is where we can help you from a regulatory standpoint and where we should get involved. There's too many times when people get to like pilot phase and then they want to get their regulatory affairs taken care of. Well, it's too late by that time, right? We can help you, but if any redesign is going to cost you more, like Dave was saying, the later in the phase that you go, the more redesign you're going to have to do, especially if you're not passing tests. If you understand further up here what your design is going to be from a regulatory standpoint, then you're not going to have to spend as much time on bad components or making sure that your critical components list is correct. Anybody know what Lean Sigma is? Lean Sigma, Six Sigma? It's something we use at SciEx quite a bit. So basically it's a way of, you've heard all these Japanese terms of poka-yoke and kaizens and like go, no go and 5 S's and all that sort of thing. So that's where it's a sort of Lean Sigma environment. It's basically understanding a concept of how a manufacturing environment and design environment is all incorporated in a systematic point of way. And the more you apply your 5S and your Lean Sigma into your development process and your manufacturing process inherently, because you're going to transfer your design into manufacturing at some point in time, the more systematic you're going to be about it, and the more you're going to understand how that whole process works. If you go back to that factory layout slide and understand what your incoming is, what your part numbering is, your product's actually going into your stock inventory, your incoming inventory, and then being able to pull that stuff and manufacture it on the field. We can help you with all that with your in-house and your system test. One of the things we do to analyze that is failure modes and effects analysis. So there's different types. There's safety, FMEAs, if you've heard that term before. Has everybody used FMEAs and failure modes and effects analysis? So you're talking about relative priority numbers. So basically you come up with a severity, a probability of detection, probability of occurrence, and you come up with a relative priority number. And then you rank your different system level or component level, whatever you want it to be, on your probability of failure, if you want to call it that. And then you can determine basically the things that you're going to go after. So low-hanging fruit. The ones with the higher relative probability numbers are going to be the things that you're going to be dealing with first because they have the highest effect on your design. So there's design FMEAs, safety FMEAs, software FMEAs. Those are sort of things that help you prioritize what you're doing, what your design is, and how to address issues that come up. Sort of associated with that in the medical device industry is hazard traceability. So you want to kind of like take that into consideration, but you also want to look at things like the severity of occurrences of things that might harm your patient. And there's like operator harm and then there's patient harm. So you have to kind of split the two out and realize that there's going to be situations where, like in a red, you might have like a low occurrence, but it might be life-threatening. So you have to treat that as a high severity item. And then you can like prioritize the design based on those functions as well too. One of the things we're coming at, we've done a couple of projects now, what's called MDR, Medical Device Regulations. Right now, as we speak, shipping to Europe uses something called MDD, which is Medical Device Detection. Right? By 2028, May 26, 2028, everybody has to be MDR compliant, which then has this whole group of regulations based around post-market surveillance, which I think Kirusha touched on quite a little bit, was something over there called UTAMED. So they have like regulatory bodies that determine when there's failures on medical devices, and they have to make sure that that stuff is being quarantined and tracked. So for example, for hip joints and breast augmentation implants and that sort of thing are the things that they're finding. I think it started for breast implants in Europe 2012. They're starting to see by 2017 that they're starting to like leak and have problems. And then they're starting to affect people that have these breast implants. And now they're starting to track the companies that made them. And they're going to have to start taking a record of them to make sure that there's traceability to watchdog those companies that are putting these kind of products on the market. Now that's coming more and more. And like I said, Europe is kind of like ahead of the curve on this sort of thing. I don't think we have the actual group here in Canada yet that keeps track of that sort of thing, but UTAMED is kind of the start in the right direction. And this whole MDR directive is moving the whole thing for medical device on a global basis to the right sort of tracking of these things, making sure that irresponsible or negligent makers of these medical devices aren't just going out there and harming people. So there's government regulations to be able to control that sort of thing now. In Canada, for medical devices, 1345, an MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program. So that helps you get to market. It's also in compliance with Chapter 820 in the FDA. So being able to get devices to market. A lot of times when we see products, people are usually going for Canadian and United States, so North American release first, and then they usually go for Europe later. So that's something that you're going to have to gauge as well too, is how you're going to deal with that and how you want to release your strategy for releasing your products, not just from a sales point of view, but also from a regulatory and design point of view as well too, which is why we're doing this. So things you're going to look about, field service and support network. Your field problem reporting process is something that you're going to have to concern yourself with quite a bit. Production readiness, jigs and fixtures, design for reliability and serviceability. That's something that people don't think a lot about, especially with high-tech products, is serviceability. Like I talked about before, right? Your shipping crate, shows up in Basel, Switzerland, and it's got screws everywhere. Well, you got to send a service guy out there to be able to fix that product or ship it back, right? So you're going to have design for serviceability taken into consideration too, depending upon the complexity of your product. So
just adding on that, now you've got to pay someone to go out there, and that adds $15,000.
well, I mean, when you're talking about aftermarket support and serviceability, I was in charge of global service management for Ziax for quite a few years. So I know what it takes to go out and fix a mass spectrometer in Basel, Switzerland. I've done it firsthand, and I've actually managed people to go out there and have like a global network of service engineers managing stuff in the Far East and Europe and Australia and that sort of thing. And it's like, you want to talk about design costs? Well, now we're talking big bucks, right? So I talked about jigs and fixtures, reliability and serviceability, IQ, OQs, and IPVs. So that's another sort of serviceability thing. Installation qualifications and operational qualifications, and instrument performance verifications. For things like mass spectrometers, these are important things to make sure that they're being installed properly, they're being serviced properly, and then they maintain a certain level of operation or performance over the years. So usually you'll do an IPV once a year to make sure that it's getting the sensitivity that you require. Clinical evaluation, Kirusha talked a little bit about. And then we talked about user experience data for next iteration of the design. So all these things about design FMEAs and all that sort of thing, what I would do is I'd travel around the world and like talk to users and customers and that sort of thing when I was doing applications training and serviceability. But I'd also work with the customer and like find out, so what are your biggest problems with the new design of the device? And then I'd take that in, put it into a design FMEA, and then work with the different design departments to be able to make sure that they were going after those high RPN numbers to make sure that the next iteration of the design is the better design for the customer use. Because that's who we're spending the money on in the first place, right? Is making sure that our customers want to buy our next iteration of product. So again, post-market surveillance. So this is kind of like a tree diagram of the layout of all the things that you're going to have to look at for MDR. Remember, you have until 2028, but start worrying about 2028 now, because the problem is notified bodies are in short demand, and you have to have a notified body to be able to apply for your MDR status. So we're building the notified bodies, but there's a lineup right now sitting here in 2025 to be able to get compliance by 2028 because there's not enough notified bodies to handle all the manufacturers. So it's better to worry about it now if you're going down this road than it is to wait until 2028. 7 principles of QMS and ISO implementation. Customer focus, management champions. No ISO program is going to work if your CFO and your CTO and your CSO, they aren't on board with the implementation of your quality management system, okay? Because usually what we would do in these situations is we have like a performance measurement on like the yearly feedback to make sure that they were handling the quality components in their departments. And that has to come down from your quality officers, right? Which is your corporate management. So in a startup environment, you have to make sure that you're usually, 3 people, there's like going to be a CTO, a CEO, and a chief science officer are going to have to be involved in that and making sure that quality is a company directive to be able to get products out to market. So I talked about QMS. I talked about systematic product development, design for manufacturing, production readiness, and post-market surveillance. And one thing I want to talk about, it's not, a lot of people say, well, is this quality management system really all that necessary and that sort of thing in this day and age? And I've seen so many companies that kind of operate everything by spreadsheets. I was vice president of operations for a mass spec company. And that company sold out to a company called PerkinElmer, essentially, for this mass spec, because they were basically like a research and development operation. The CEO of the company didn't really give it much credence to develop a quality management system. And they basically sold the R&D shop for $20 million to PerkinElmer. And now PerkinElmer sells a mass spec based on that technology. Have you heard of a company called Baylis? So they sold out to Boston Scientific. And really the only difference between Baylis and this company that I'm talking about, right, is that Baylis had a quality management system, an operational quality management system, and one that was actually functioning properly. They sold it to Boston Scientific for $1.5 billion. So if you want to put it down in a brass tacks, 20 million versus 1.5 billion is a good reason to have a quality management system. Okay? And that's that.